It wasn't the will reading that shattered it, not exactly. It was the teacup, a small porcelain thing rimmed in gold with a tiny chip near the handle that only I ever noticed. Mother had used it every morning for her Earl Grey, even when she was too frail to lift it herself. After she passed, it sat on the mantelpiece untouched, a quiet sentinel to a life lived. Then on my 70th birthday, Daniel, my son, picked it up. He was talking about his new investment, something in tech, all grand pronouncements and dismissive waves of his hand. He gestured, and the teacup his fingers wrapped around it just moved. Not a drop, not a break, just a shift, a slight rotation of its chipped side away from me. He never even saw the chip, I knew that. He never saw anything but what he wanted. And for a second, no one said a word. If this sounds like your silence, stay. You don't owe them your forgiveness, not anymore. And if you know a woman who carried too much for too long, give her this story. It wasn't a loud moment, you see. No arguments, no raised voices. It was a silent theft, years in the making, but crystallized in that small, almost imperceptible turn of a porcelain cup. Mother had left me the house explicitly. Her words whispered on her deathbed were, "My home is yours, my daughter. Always." Daniel, her only grandson, was to receive a trust set up years ago, ample enough for any young man. But he always wanted more. He always felt entitled to more. And Mother, in her gentle way, had tried to give him everything to appease his restless spirit. It never worked, it only fueled it. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. He'd started subtly first with questions about her accounts, then managing her bills, then convincing her to sign papers she didn't quite understand. He painted himself as the dutiful son caring for his aging grandmother. I saw it, of course. I saw the fear in her eyes when she asked me quietly, "Did I sign that paper for the new car?" Dear Daniel said it was for the taxes. She didn't own a car. She hadn't driven in years. And still I held my tongue. The shame of confronting him, of disrupting the fragile peace of her last years, felt heavier than the injustice. So I watched, and I listened, and I collected the quiet, damning details in my mind. The missing jewelry, the changed locks, the hushed phone calls, each a tiny chip just like the one on the teacup. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. He came to me after her funeral, full of practiced grief and a casual certainty that grated on my soul. "Mother made some changes, you know," he said, his voice low, almost sympathetic, "to the will. She wanted me to have the house, said you had your own and I needed a fresh start." He spoke as if it were a generosity on his part, a burden he was bravely taking on. My own house, a small cottage Mother had helped me buy years ago, was modest, nothing compared to the grand, sprawling home she had lived in her whole life, and the trust he already had. It was enough to buy a dozen fresh starts. But he needed hers. He needed to erase my claim, my memory, my inheritance, as if it had never been mine to begin with. He expected me to nod, to understand, to graciously step aside. He always had. He had this way of looking at you, not quite into your eyes, but past them, as if he was already seeing the next thing he wanted just beyond your shoulder. It wasn't malice, not exactly, more like an absence of you, an emptiness where understanding should have been. And I, like Mother, had always tried to fill that void, to make myself small enough to fit into his expansive needs. To be the compliant mother, the understanding sister, the silent observer. But watching him pick up that teacup so carelessly, so utterly unaware of its history, its meaning, it was like a small, sharp stone finally dislodging itself from my heart. It wasn't rage that filled the space. It was a profound, almost peaceful clarity. And for a second, no one said a word. The others, my nieces and nephews, their spouses, they all murmured their condolences, their sympathies for Daniel's loss. They thought I was being strong stoic. They didn't see the years of small sacrifices, the quiet erosion of my own spirit. They just saw a woman who seemed to be coping well. They complimented his initiative, his business acumen. No one questioned the rapid transfer of assets, the swift sale of Mother's antique furniture, the sudden renovations he started planning for a house he hadn't yet legally secured. He moved quickly, a shark in calm waters, and everyone around him just assumed he was a dolphin. You call it love, but I was the only one losing pieces of myself to it. I started to collect proof, not in a dramatic, legalistic way, but in the quiet, methodical manner of a woman who has finally seen enough. Copies of bank statements, dates of phone calls, snippets of conversations overheard. It wasn't about vengeance, not then. It was about seeing the truth for myself, holding it in my hands, confirming what my gut had screamed for years. It was about recognizing the pattern, the deep-seated entitlement that had always simmered beneath his charm. He had taken from Mother not just her money, but her peace of mind in her final years. He had taken from me not just an inheritance, but the validation of my place in our family, the respect of my own son. I didn't hurt them, I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. On my 70th birthday, a few months after Mother's passing, Daniel threw me a party. Or rather, his wife did, at his insistence. It was at Mother's house now, stripped bare of her personality, filled with sleek, modern furniture that felt alien and cold. He stood beside me as I blew out the candles, his arm around my shoulder, a performative gesture for the guests. He raised a glass, his voice booming. To my wonderful mother, so strong, so resilient, always there for everyone. The words felt like a physical blow. He spoke of my strength, my resilience, as if it were a virtue he admired, not a quality he had relentlessly tested and exploited. His arm heavy on my shoulder felt like a branding iron. He was playing the part of the loving son, the generous host in a house that should have been mine, surrounded by people who saw only his carefully constructed facade. I smiled, a small, tight smile that didn't reach my eyes, a skill perfected over decades. I accepted the compliments, the well wishes, each one a feather on a scale that was already tipping. I saw the teacup again sitting on the new minimalist mantelpiece, a stark contrast to its surroundings. It was chipped still, but now it looked out of place, an unwanted remnant of a life he had so quickly, so thoroughly dismantled. And for a second, no one said a word. The gift, that was the culmination. He had given me a small engraved silver locket. For memory's Mother, he'd said, pressing it into my palm. A cruel irony, I thought, considering he'd systematically stripped away so many of them. I had already prepared my own gift for him. It wasn't wrapped, wasn't tied with a bow. It was simply there in my handbag, a slim, official-looking envelope. I had waited for this moment, for the gathering of all the witnesses, for the stage he had so meticulously set. You call it family, but I was the only one paying the price for belonging. When it was my turn to speak after all the toasts and the clinking of glasses, I stood up slowly. The room grew quiet, expectant. Daniel looked at me, a slight, almost imperceptible frown on his face. He expected a tearful thank you, a public acknowledgement of his perceived generosity. Instead, I held up the envelope. Daniel, I said, my voice clear, steady, this is for you. A gift from my heart. There was a ripple of curiosity in the room. He took it, a polite, slightly wary smile on his face. He opened it, and as his eyes scanned the document inside, his smile evaporated. His face went ashen. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. It was a notice of intent to contest Mother's will, meticulously detailing every suspicious transaction, every instance of undue influence, every whisper of a lie. It wasn't just my claim to the house. It was a thorough, undeniable exposé of his calculated deceit. I had engaged the best legal team quietly, discreetly for months. They had compiled a dossier that would not only reclaim my inheritance but expose his actions to the world. It was all there laid bare for everyone in that room to see in the stark legal language of justice. His hands trembled, the paper rustling softly. The room, once buzzing with polite chatter, had fallen into an unnerving silence. Every eye was on him then, on me. His wife, who had been beaming moments before now, looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her face was a mask of confusion, then dawning horror. The gift of the locket still in my palm felt heavy, a stark contrast to the lightness I suddenly felt in my chest. This wasn't about the money, not anymore. It was about the truth finally being spoken about, the silence finally being broken. And for a second, no one said a word. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and vacant. The charm was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He tried to speak, but only a strangled sound emerged. The carefully constructed image, the dutiful son, the savvy businessman, crumbled before everyone's eyes. The veneer he'd so meticulously maintained for years, the one that had fooled so many, was stripped away in an instant. I saw his father in him then, not in his features, but in that particular shade of panic, that desperate scramble for an exit. His father, who had also believed he was above consequences, who had also taken without asking. You call it loyalty, but I was the only one paying for their comfort. The party dissolved quickly after that. People found excuses to leave their goodbyes, mumbled their gazes, avoiding mine. His wife led him away, whispering urgently, her arm around his rigid back. The house, so recently filled with forced gaiety, was suddenly empty save for me and the chipped teacup on the mantel. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the tiny flaw. It felt lighter now, no longer a silent burden, but simply an object with a history. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. He called me later that night, his voice a guttural mix of rage and disbelief. He threatened, he pleaded, he accused. I listened calm and unyielding. Each word he spoke, each desperate accusation only served to reinforce the righteousness of my actions. He still didn't understand, not truly. He still believed he was the victim, that I had betrayed him. But the truth, once unleashed, has a way of finding its own path, even through the densest of deceptions. The legal process would be long, messy, and public. His reputation, his carefully curated life, would be irrevocably altered. And I, for the first time in a very long time, felt a profound, quiet sense of peace. The teacup, once a symbol of silent suffering, was now just a chipped piece of porcelain, and I, the woman who had carried so much for so long, was finally free. The aftermath wasn't dramatic, not in the way a film would portray it. There were no shouting matches, no public confrontations on the street. It was a slow, deliberate unwinding, like a tightly wound spring finally releasing. The lawyers handled the majority of it, their communications precise and formal. Daniel tried to reach out a few more times, his calls oscillating between thinly veiled threats and tearful pleas. I never answered. My silence, once a burden, had become my most powerful tool. Each unanswered call, each ignored email was a tiny chip in his carefully constructed world, mirroring the chip on the teacup. And for a second, no one said a word. His friends, the ones who had clapped him on the back at my birthday party, slowly distanced themselves. The whispers started, as they always do. Not loud accusations, just quiet questions, a shift in tone when his name came up. His business ventures, once touted as brilliant, began to falter under the weight of the scrutiny. The foundation of trust which he had so recklessly undermined was now crumbling around him. It wasn't an act of aggression on my part. It was simply the natural consequence of his own actions finally brought to light. You call it family, but I was the only one holding the threads together. I spent more time in Mother's house during the legal process. It felt different now, no longer a battleground, but a place of quiet reclamation. I found old photo albums he had overlooked, letters tucked away in drawers, small mementos he deemed worthless. Each discovery was a tiny piece of the past, retrieved from the wreckage of his greed. I didn't restore it to how Mother had it. Instead, I slowly made it my own, painting the walls in soft, comforting colors, filling it with books and art that reflected my life, not just hers. It became a sanctuary, not a trophy. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. The final settlement came months later. It was favorable entirely. The house was legally mine, along with a significant portion of what had been taken from Mother's estate. Daniel was left with his trust, still substantial, but his pride, his perceived infallibility, was shattered. He never apologized. He never acknowledged the harm he had caused. But then I never expected him to. His understanding wasn't the point. My peace was. And on the day the papers were signed, I sat in Mother's garden, the sun warm on my face, and thought of the chipped teacup. It was still on my mantelpiece, a quiet reminder of a moment that had felt like a fracture, but had ultimately led to my freedom. There was no triumph, no gloating, just a deep, abiding quiet. The gentle execution was complete.